Hey all, today we're going to continue our discussion of circles and segments in circles and how they interact to create arcs and angles that we can discuss. So we started with central angles where the vertex was at the center of the circle, and in this case that would be at point A. And now we're going to talk about angles formed by chords. So I have two chords, chord BC and chord DE. They don't go through the center, so I don't have any radii or diameters. But they do intersect here at point F to create four angles. And this should look relatively familiar because we used segments or lines like this when we talked about vertical angles. So those two angles are congruent. And then these two angles are congruent. I'll put two arcs to show that they're congruent to each other, but not these two guys. We have linear pairs as well. And so we know some relationships between the angles. So now let's talk about the relationship between the angles and the arcs. So if I look at this angle, which again is congruent to this one, same size, this angle makes this arc or intercepts that arc BE. And the angle it's congruent to, its vertical angle over here intercepts arc DC. And so what we get is a relationship between this angle measure and these two arcs. And what it is that that angle is the average of those two arcs. So this angle measure right here, BFE, whatever that measure is the average of arc BE and arc DC. So again, to average, you add and divide by, in this case, 2, because we have two arcs. So that would look something like this. BFE and CFD, so let me mark that. That's CFD. Those two angles are equal, and their measure is going to be equal to the average of these two arcs. So add them and divide by 2. Similarly, those two angles, put two arcs, sorry, it's kind of chunky. Those two angles are equal, they're vertical angles. They have a relationship between arc CE and arc BD. Same relationship. It's equal to the average of those two arcs, BD and CE. So let's look at that in practice. Here I'm looking for the angle measure question mark. And so this angle creates this arc that's 119 degrees. Its vertical angle over here creates this arc that's 65 degrees. And so the relationship is that this angle is equal to the average of those two arcs. I like every time you use a formula or use some sort of relationship that you write it down. And when you do that, you commit that relationship to memory. So the angle is equal to the average of the two arcs. Plug question mark in for the angle, and then I average the two arcs, and I end up with that angle being 92 degrees. And so that means this angle question mark's 92 degrees, and this angle over here is also 92 degrees. I'll do a similar one. I'm looking for that angle which intercepts that arc. Its vertical angle over here intercepts that arc. And so again, the relationship is that the angle is the average of the two arcs, and write it down every time and you'll remember it. I'm going to plug in and simplify to find that angle to be 59. So both of these vertical angles here are 59 degrees. What's also cool is that you can then find out how big this angle is, because my angle that's 59 degrees should be supplementary to this one because they're linear pairs. So if we subtract 59 from 180, we'd get 121. So we know that angle is 121, and so is that one. That's just a little side note here. So of course we can complicate this a little bit by throwing in expressions and having you solve for x. But the way you do it is the same. 9x plus 13 represents this angle, and that angle intercepts that arc, and its vertical angle intercepts this arc. So this angle 9x plus 13 is equal to the average of 110 and 60. So we'll just plug in and write the formula every time. Oops, sorry about that. Write the formula every time and plug in. So this time, instead of question mark over here, I have this expression 9x plus 13. No big deal. We'll simplify the right side. And now we have an equation to solve. Subtract 13 from both sides and divide by 9. And I get x to be 8. So we can use this relationship in the opposite way, sort of, where we know the angle and we want to find one of the intercepted arcs. So this time we know this angle is 95, and so we know this angle is 95 as well. The arcs they intercept are this one that's 130 and this one that's question mark. And so I'm going to plug 95 in for my angle, again writing the equation every time. Plug 95 in for where the angle is, and then my average question mark and 130. Of course, I can't simplify this side now because I have a variable. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of this divided by 2. This becomes 190. This numerator remains unchanged because multiplying this side by 2 simply cancels that 2 out. And now I just have to subtract 130 from both sides to find out that this arc is 60 degrees. Let me do another one. 53 belongs to this angle. It intercepts this arc of 55 degrees. Its vertical angle intercepts the arc that we're looking for. And so we'll plug in, of course, writing the formula. 53 goes in for the angle, and then I'll average the two arcs. Again, I can't simplify this side. I have to multiply both sides by 2, which would cancel that 2 and make that 53 106. Subtract 55, and I get 51 degrees for my arc over here. Which, let me point out, 51 degrees makes sense, I think. Visually, you can see that this arc and this arc of 55 look like they're pretty close to the same size. And of course, 51 and 55 are pretty close in measure. And let's do one last one where we complicate it a bit with some variables, but we do the same thing. So there's my angle. It intercepts this large arc. And then its vertical angle intercepts that arc, and we want to solve for x. So again, we'll write the formula every time. Plug 120 in for the angle, and we'll average the arcs 10x and 38x. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to cancel this 2 out, and then I'll simplify this by adding the like terms and get 240 equals 48x, and finally divide by 48 and get the x is 5. So I do have 3 questions for you to try. They're on separate screens, so make sure you pause and answer the question. Make sure you watch all the way to the end so you answer all 3 questions. So remember, if you have any questions on any of these problems or anything that we talked about in this lesson, be sure to ask me when we see each other in class.